All right, let's dive into a pretty radical idea today. What if our political beliefs, the things we argue about, the things we feel so strongly about, what if they aren't just about logic or values? What if they're actually tied to how much stress we're under? It's a whole new way of looking at political division, not as some kind of moral failure, but maybe as a psychological survival strategy.
So let me just put the central question right out there. Could it be that some political views are really just a deep, almost unconscious response to stress? A way our brains try to manage a world that feels chaotic and uncertain. Think about that for a second. To kind of get our heads around this quote from psychiatrist Dr. Tracey Marks is perfect. She says, most of us aren't really operating at our full potential. Instead, we're kind of hovering, focusing on just trying to belong, to feel safe, to have some status. And look, that's not a criticism. It's just human nature. But it raises a huge question. What happens when we get stuck there? Now, I'm sure you've seen this before, right? Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's that classic pyramid. You start at the bottom with the absolute basics: food, water, shelter. Get those sorted, and you move up to safety, then love and belonging, esteem. And if you're lucky, you hit the very top, self-actualization, reaching your full potential. It seems like a simple, straightforward ladder to climb.
But here's where it gets really interesting. And this is the point Dr. Marks makes. Life isn't just a one-way trip up that pyramid. When we're under stress, we don't just stop climbing. We can actually slide right back down. We can get stuck on one of those lower levels, just spinning our wheels, constantly trying to feel safe or to feel like we belong. And that can keep us from ever reaching those higher states of growth.
So let's reframe this whole thing. What if getting stuck isn't really about failing to climb a ladder? What if it's more fundamental? What if it's about our entire mental operating system completely changing its mode when it's under pressure? This is where a really fascinating new framework comes in, called the Brain Kinematics Model, or BKM for short.
And this slide just shows that shift in thinking so perfectly. On the left, you've got Maslow's pyramid. It's static, it's fixed. But on the right, you have the BKM's idea of dynamic arcs. So instead of these rigid levels, the BKM says our needs are more like different operating modes for our brain, each with its own unique rhythm of energy, which it calls a strain arc.
So, what in the world is a strain arc? Well, think of it like the basic pulse of your mental life. It's the life cycle of a single thought or feeling. It kicks off with an onset, right? A need gets triggered. Then comes the climb. That's your brain mobilizing all its resources to deal with whatever it is. And finally, you get resolution. Either the need is met or your mind just shifts to something else. And if you break it down, you can really see that flow. There's a trigger, then a period of mental work, and then an outcome. Literally everything we do, from feeling a little hungry to trying to solve a huge problem at work, it all follows the same basic pattern. But, and this is the absolute key, the shape of that pattern is totally different depending on the need.
And this is where it gets so cool. This chart visualizes those different shapes. A basic need, like hunger, is a super sharp, urgent spike. A safety threat, that's a really steep climb and then a very fast decision. But look over at self-actualization. It's this wide, smooth, long-term arc. It's a state of high mental activity, but it's low threat. The BKM calls this a quiet high mode. It's where we do our best, most creative thinking.
Okay, so if those strain arcs describe our mental energy over time, is there a way to visualize our cognitive state in a single snapshot? Well, the BKM has a tool for that too. It's called the OVC triangle. It basically maps our thinking onto 3 points: the object, which is our sense of self or a threat, the verb, which is our urge to act, and the concept, our ability for abstract thought.
And boom, this is where it all connects back to politics. The shape of our personal OVC triangle actually changes depending on how much strain we're under. When we feel safe, when we have plenty of mental bandwidth, that triangle is wide and balanced. And that corresponds to a more deliberative, open-minded political style. But what happens when we feel threatened? The triangle compresses, the concept part shrinks way down, and we're just dominated by a rigid object, us versus them, and an urgent verb. We have to act now. This is literally the cognitive geometry of authoritarian and populist thinking.
This table just lays out those two strategies side by side so clearly. On one side, you've got the pluralist democratic taste. It's all about growth. When it's stressed, its go-to move is to seek out more information, to understand more. Then you have the order/identity protective taste. It's anchored in safety. When it's stressed, its goal is the exact opposite: compression. Simplify the problem, find a quick solution, and get strong control to make that feeling of threat go away.
Here's another amazing analogy. Think about sleep. Deep sleep, that's a state of basically zero politics, right? You're just out. But light sleep, that's a super threat-sensitive state. Every little noise, every creak in the floor puts you on high alert. The BKM suggests that authoritarian thinking is kind of like we're importing that light sleep safety logic into our waking lives. We end up in a state that's optimized for spotting threats, not for complex, nuanced thinking.
So this all leads to a really critical question for us right now. If our entire cognitive state is so dependent on how much strain we're under, what is it about our modern world that's pushing us, and maybe even keeping us, in that compressed, defensive mindset all the time?
Well, the BKM points a big finger at our modern media environment. It basically acts like a giant strain amplifier. You've got threat framing, which makes our object, our sense of self and safety, feel like it's constantly at risk. Then you have the constant alerts and notifications creating that verb urgency. And complex ideas, they get boiled down into simple slogans, which compresses the concept. And what's the end result? We can get artificially locked into a stuck safety state, even when our actual physical world is perfectly fine.
And this really brings us to the core takeaway here. According to this model, a preference for democracy isn't some sign of being a morally superior person. It's a high-bandwidth, high-energy way of thinking. It actually requires a brain that feels safe enough to afford things like deliberation, nuance, and long-term planning. When that sense of safety vanishes, the brain just reverts to what it knows best: faster, narrower, more protective strategies.
So I'll just leave you with this final, pretty challenging question to think about. If our politics is really just a giant mirror reflecting back our collective psychological strain, what is our environment right now telling us about the state of our own minds?